I give you Annette Michelson. We're most fortunate to have her down from New York. She's exhausted, I'll tell you to begin with, so that she's going to talk before the film to you and answer what questions you have at this point. So there won't be a question and answer period afterwards, so please feel free at the end of her introduction to question her now. Annette Michelson.
Good evening. I think that the best way to proceed is to give you some notion of how I myself came to be involved with the history and the aesthetics, the stylistics of Soviet cinema. It seems to me that there has never been in the history of cinema a period quite so intensive, quite so rich, quite so innovative, quite so fruitful in its consequences for the medium. The period of which I'm talking is relatively brief, by the way. It extends from about 1924 through 1933. That is through the production of the first sound films in the Soviet Union. Sound came later to the Soviet Union than it did in America. And the period with which I'm concerned, and with which we're concerned not only this evening, but in the series of films to follow, covers then about 9, maybe 10 years. Now, it seems to me that there has never been, as well, a particular achievement in the history of the medium which was greeted so immediately and so universally with discernment and warmth. Soviet film, when it burst upon the world, and it burst upon the world really a little late, which is say around 1929, through the showings of Eisenstein's Potemkin in the West, this film, when it burst upon the world, was received with enormous warmth. The literature produced on it, the immediate critical literature, was enormous. It produced a great deal of theoretical writing as well. It has produced, by the way, a few of the major historical works in film. Film history is a relatively undeveloped kind of history. People involved in it come very largely from a love of film and without the kind of preparation and historical methodology that scholars in other periods and other media have. The notion, for example, of what constitutes causality in film history is still rather vague. In any case, this film produced, or elicited rather, from historians a number of interesting works, and in general, among the large public, not only among the specialists, but among the greater public, popular public, there was a great deal of immediate interest and respect for the achievements of the revolutionary generation which produced Soviet cinema. So much so that, as you know probably, Soviet cinema, and Eisenstein in particular, found some of his most ardent fans in Hollywood. Now, it seemed to me, however, that the first wave of enthusiasm which greeted this film had by now, which is to say, by the time I became concerned with it, let's say in the 50s and 60s, had subsided. And partly due to certain developments in the history of film, in the history of criticism, but also, I think, because a great many of the ways in which this film was dealt with, critically and historically, were by now exhausted or no longer meaningful to us. It seems to me that although there exists no era in film which has been more widely commented upon, it seems to me nevertheless that everything in a sense remains to be done for and by our generation. And it occurred to me that I should like, with a few friends and students, to begin to try and do this. Thinking in that direction then, I set about thinking as well of the ways in which one could redefine the importance of Soviet cinema for our time. And it seemed to me that among the considerations that one would have to make were the following. First of all, that this is the film of a revolutionary generation, that it is a film which acts, so to speak, as the emblem of a certain kind of revolutionary consciousness, revolutionary aspiration. But that was known, of course, in the 1920s and the 1930s. Secondly, it seemed to me that what is particularly important about this achievement, the achievement of this period, is that it constitutes the realization of a kind of fusion between an aspiration which is politically radical and an aspiration which is aesthetically radical. That it constitutes, as a matter of fact, a kind of paradigm for the 20th century of that fusion. Thirdly, it was produced by a generation of people who had inherited, as revolutionaries, as European intellectuals, who were the inheritors of, let us say, a certain kind of intellectual and philosophical tradition. That is, there were people who were the inheritors of the last of the major philosophical systems in Europe, that of Hegel. And they felt that there was, as well as a creative task, a certain kind of theoretical task, a task of theoretical explication, justification, if you wish, which devolved upon them. They felt this to be their responsibility, part of their responsibility as artists, as filmmakers. So that these were three of the concerns which it seemed to me remained to be examined fully in treating of Soviet cinema for our generation. Now, one other consideration I think was important, and that is the fact that this development, this double development, or this fusion, if you like, of a revolutionary aspiration, radical in character, and an aesthetic movement, radical in character, occurred not only within the context of the Soviet revolutionary generation, but within the context of a particular international climate of the 20s. And that what I think has not been properly seen, and that is something that I hope will be corrected perhaps by the kind of program that we've set up here, is the fact that Soviet film and Soviet filmmakers and their work were part of a general movement in the 20s, a movement that was international in scope and that was innovative in its aesthetic character. So that to study Soviet film, or to think of it, to even view it as a spectator, as being isolated, as being simply national in character, as seeing it as an expression simply of a given revolutionary generation in one specific country, would be a mistake. That one would have to view it as being fed, nourished, sustained by parallel attempts and parallel achievements in other media and in other countries. Therefore, it seemed to me of interest to consider very carefully, let's say, what Eisenstein was trying to do in film and what Vertov was trying to do in film in connection with what a major Cubist painter such as Léger attempted to do when he came to film. These are some of the considerations which underlay my own nascent interest in Soviet film and which have, I think, determined the choice of films made by Sally Dixon and myself for the coming series. one other thing. Almost all the filmmakers that we are concerned with came, of course, not from film originally. They were people who came from interest in other arts, and some of them from the sciences. And they brought to their work in film that kind of training, that kind of rigor, aesthetic, and scientific as well, theoretical, which they had derived in their early training, whether as theater people working under Meyerhold, the most advanced of theater men in that part of the century, whether working under Pavlov, as Pudovkin had, whether working under Kuleshov, as almost all of them had in their apprenticeship in the techniques of montage. The battle for the specificity of film as a medium is a battle which has been fought throughout this century by anyone seriously interested in film. That has been the kind of classic critical battle fought, if not won, by anyone attempting to gain a certain kind of autonomy and a certain kind of status for the medium of film. The Russians were concerned with this, but they had another concern as well. They were concerned not simply with divorcing film from other art forms. They saw it as one more art form, and they were concerned, for example, not with the rejection of the theater in favor of film. They were concerned always with the rejection of what is dead in theater, or what was dead in another art form. So that, as you will see in Strike, Eisenstein is a very young man, fresh from theatrical experiences of a very extraordinary kind in Meyerhold's theater, brings to Strike, in his direction of actors, in certain ways of framing, a sensibility which is derived from that of the theater. And he was not alone in this. Pudovkin, one of the supreme actors of Soviet cinema as well, brought to his direction of actors and to his filmic compositions a sense of the theater which was derived from the most advanced kind of theatrical experiments then being performed in Europe. So that all of these young men, and they were, of course, very young, they were, for the most part at this time, younger than my own students in graduate school at NYU are, who were studying film, these men brought with them a great many kinds of attitudes, kinds of equipments derived from their training, and which helped, in a sense, to give film its place in the general kind of aesthetic context of post-revolutionary Russia, a context, of course, which was animated very, very largely by the major aesthetic impulse of constructivism. I want also to stress, before I begin to speak of Eisenstein in particular, another aspect of their relationship or their notions about film, and it was something which they shared with almost every modernist artist and with every film theoretician of that particular time, and that was a particular faith in the cinema as a transforming agent, an agent of transformation, of social transformation, of course. The cinema as an agent, as an instrument of revolution. Let us say above and beyond this, if you like. They saw cinema as an agent of the transformation of consciousness. And in this, they were at one with almost every writer of an advanced kind, at that time concerned with film. That is, they believed with Walter Benjamin in Germany, they believed with Jean Epstein and Benjamin Fondan and the Surrealists in France. they believed with American intellectuals here, a man like Hugo Münsterberg or a man like Theodor Dreiser, they believed in film as essentially a new agent for the refinement and the transformation of consciousness in the following sense. They felt that there was something inherently revelatory about the cinematic process itself. They felt, and Vertov speaks of this very touchingly in a way, they felt that the cinema's techniques contained instruments for analysis of a kind which had never before existed. That looking at the image of a man in motion, of the world in motion, being able to stop it, to reverse it, to superimpose it upon another, brought to our notions of what reality is, of what causality is, a kind of precision which had never before been available. Vertov speaks, for example, of seeing himself for the very, very first time photographed in slow motion doing a kind of leap, a rather perilous kind of leap. And he says, I saw truth on my face. He said, I saw the emotions on my face, the mixture of emotions on my face in the most extraordinary way. And he then goes on to speak of the cinema as being revelatory of complexities of feelings and emotions, making visible, rendering visible complexities of emotion and feeling which had never before been visible. We find exactly the same preoccupation among some of the French artists and filmmakers. Jean Epstein in the 20s, major French theorist, speaks of the way in which he conceives cinema as essentially a kind of potential truth machine. And he says, were one to have a criminal and examine him by simply taking a slow motion picture of him, he said, one feels one would arrive at a truthful testimony. And Walter Benjamin speaks of slow motion as giving a kind of a hold on the reality of the world, which is equal, or which has as an analog only psychoanalysis. He says we can psychoanalyze the world through the motion picture. And the Soviets were very, very conscious of that as well, and so that one can see, in a sense, the development of Soviet cinema as increasingly concerned in the period with which we are concerned, let's say from 1924 through, let's say, 1933, and culminating in 1929-30 in the work of Vertov, in an extremely reflexive, kind of apperceptive mode, as a kind of meditation upon not only the possibility of revolution and the transformation of society, but the transformation of consciousness itself. So these are some of the concerns, the basic concerns, which animated the Soviet filmmakers. Oh yes, to them I must add one other. And it is perhaps, at least for our immediate practical purposes, that is, for the purpose of gaining some kind of insight into the evolution, the specifics of the evolution of Soviet film style, it is a particularly important one. They had, as did I think every innovative filmmaker and perhaps every innovative artist of that period, a sense of film as being par excellence a synthetic medium. A medium in which the will of the artist was absolute. A medium which is purely fabricated, in which artifice, technique were paramount. And they had this sense very largely because they were themselves so instrumental in developing the techniques involved in this kind of synthesis. The development of those techniques and the development of Soviet style rest, as you probably know, upon the kind of unique and intensive use that was made of the process of montage. This was not, in any sense, something that they had invented. They speak of it, Eisenstein, Kuleshov both, speak of it as encountered first in the films of Griffith, later in the films of someone like Fritz Lang. Eisenstein's very first job in the movies was to do a kind of re-editing job of a major film of Lang's called Mabuse, Der Spieler, which was a film which was circulated in the Soviet Union, and it was the custom at that time in the Soviet Union to re-edit films, put them back on the editing table and kind of go over them, do another kind of job for the specific Soviet public. These men learned then their editing technique from seeing the films of Griffith and the films of all sorts of other people. The film industry before the revolution had been highly developed. There had been great interest in it in literary and political circles. The film industry had spread throughout Russia. There were films being shown at country fairs in Russia in Tsarist times. There was considerable film production in Tsarist times, and some excellent films made. But though they had not invented it, they had given it more systematic thought than almost anyone else had. This is the way in which they conceived their role. To think about it in some kind of systematic way, to make explicit and to make perhaps more practically useful, and perhaps to develop a more coherent aesthetic than had yet been developed in American film or even in German film of that period. And in doing so, of course, they were again very much involved in a kind of extension of that major intellectual responsibility, which I said they felt devolved upon them. And they set about doing so very largely in the early years of the 20s, 1922, 23, 24, in a workshop which has since become legendary, which was held by a very young man named Lev Kuleshov, who was about 19 at the time, a gifted teenager, and who developed with his students, some of them 2 or 3 years older than himself, men like Pudovkin and Eisenstein, a way of analyzing and synthesizing film which stands still as a kind of paradigm of montage. I shan't detail to you I shan't tell you all the details of the Kuleshov experiments, and I'm sure they are familiar to many of you. But what they involved was the realization that one could, through the proper juxtaposition of elements, create a synthetic space, a synthetic character, a synthetic action. One could, in fact, synthesize by combining, let us say, the shot of a man, the shot of a soup bowl, the shot of a man, the shot of a soup bowl and a crying infant. What one could, through the simple juxtaposition of shots, create whole dramatic situations. One could, through the simple juxtaposition of close-ups or medium shots even, of parts of a woman's body, create different women's bodies, create a synthetic woman. And the realization and the utilization of this extreme kind of synthesis is the basis, is so to speak, the basic postulate on which the glory of Russian cinema reposes. This meant a number of things. It meant that the concentration was upon not only images, but the relationships created between images. It meant as well that the relationships between images tended, in a sense, to take precedence over movement of the camera within images, so that the classic style of Soviet montage tends to be the brilliantly, rather swiftly, almost hyperbolically edited style, in which camera movement is actually kept to a minimum. As we shall see, the masters of montage were also masters of breaking their own rules, and as you will see, Strike, which is perhaps the first major work by a major master in this style, starts with a fantastic crane shot. And it starts with a fantastic crane shot because Eisenstein, though a theoretician, was not above a certain brilliant empiricism, and shooting in a factory, he was obviously entranced by the decor in which he was working. As one will see later in Potemkin, the use that he makes of the battleship is extraordinary. And the first thing he does, of course, is to use the industrial cranes of the factory that he's working in, and to shoot absolutely brilliant crane shots. He does this somewhat later in the film as well. But the basic postulate of the Soviet style is then a certain kind of synthetic, very brilliantly edited style in which camera action is to some extent minimized. Now, what is extraordinary about this is, of course, the intense variety of effects. Effects, by the way, is hardly the word. The extraordinary range of formal and dramatic modes and intensities which one can create with this style. It produces visual metaphors, showers, cascades of visual metaphors of extreme brilliance. It produces dramatic effects of great pathos. It produces comic effects of great sharpness. And all of these, of course, you will see in Strike, which is a perfect laboratory, not only of Eisenstein's work, but of Soviet cinema in general. And that is why I've chosen Strike as the first film for us to look at in this series. It is the work of a very young man, a 25-year-old, and it ushers in, so to speak, after a few very brilliant preparatory works, the era of Russian cinema. Now, what does one see in Strike? Well, one sees, to begin with, this opening crane shot. One sees a film which is in itself, in its overall global structure, a huge kind of metaphor of the revolution, the strike. It is both a moment in the history of revolution, and it is a metaphor for the revolution, which is to say that it immediately embodies one of the prime strategies of Eisenstein and his montage technique. That is, it presents, so to speak, a part for the whole. It presents what we know in rhetoric as a synecdoche. And Eisenstein's concern, not simply as an artist, not simply as a filmmaker, but as a member of that generation for whom the study of literature, the study of linguistics, the interest in the properties of language extended to film language has a particular importance. Strike, then, is many things. It is drama, it is a film, it ushers in the era of Soviet filmmaking, it ushers in the montage technique in its really hyperbolic instance, but it does so in a way which, so to speak, globally, in its totality, sums up a number of the kinds of formal preoccupations which are to be found in its details, in its shots. We see also in Strike that cascade of metaphors which I began to speak before. Um, among the most celebrated ones, apart from the strike itself, is the use of, at the end of the film, when the strikers are defeated, the intercutting of the slaughter of animals and the massacre of the strikers. There is a kind of parallelism between animal and the human world, which is detailed throughout the film. There are episodes which, in their kind of erotic irony, I'm thinking of the scene of a spy, which we'll see, who is being tempted by the Tsar's officers at the same time, near a loaded banquet table on which a pair of dwarfs are dancing a kind of parody of a tango. The film is full of these metaphors. What I think is perhaps of more interest to us immediately is the manner in which Eisenstein introduces something which is primary in the development of the history of film, and not only for Soviet film. And that is the way he introduces sequences which tend to contract and distend temporality, time. One doesn't, I begin to think myself of Eisenstein as being one of the supreme masters of suspense. And my ambition at NYU, by the way, is to give kind of a course in suspense, which will essentially run from Eisenstein to Hitchcock by way of Michael Snow. But there is a sequence in 10 Days That Shook the World, known as October, which I think you'll be seeing later in this series, and is perhaps one of the most celebrated sequences in all of Eisenstein, and to my mind, perhaps one of the greatest sequences in the history of cinema, in which a number of people revolting against the government are caught on a bridge, and the bridge is opened, and in the opening of the bridge, a number of people are killed. It is a sequence which recounts, so to speak, an action which has a certain specifiable, though putative, time duration. It's one of the longest sequences in the film, and it consists of some 150 shots. And the raising of the bridge, suspension bridge, is broken, fragmented, so that one's experience of that sequence is actually an experience of a time duration which is more than that of the action. It is a subjective time duration, in a sense. It's duration which is distended in a kind of suspense of action. In Strike, we notice something else, and that is that in a sequence in which, for example, as you will see, some strikers are proceeding to having a meeting in the woods, they walk along, they're talking, they're singing, and the entire time, on the scene of them walking toward their destination, we have a superimposition of an accordion playing. And the accordion is contracting and expanding. And what happens is that in that image, that superimposed image of the accordion over the walk, we have a kind of contraction. We have a feeling that what is being said is that the distance or the time of the walk is the time of an accordion song, and that time has been contracted into the simple movement of the accordion. So Eisenstein has a way, not simply of playing with time, but of molding it, of shaping it, of distending it and contracting it, which is of supreme importance for the development of a medium which is, above all, of course, a medium of temporality. In Strike, another thing that you will notice is the somewhat heterogeneous quality of the acting. It's excellent. There's a great deal of very, very, as we say, I think, stylized acting. What we mean by that is an acting which is not resolutely psychological in its sense of nuance, but an acting which is conceived in terms of silhouette, in terms of contrasts of character, which is conceived in terms of certain specific weights of character, which is resolutely anti-psychological, as a matter of fact, in its style. And this is a style of acting, of course, which Eisenstein derives very largely from his work in the avant-garde theater of Meyerhold, a theater which was resolutely anti-psychological, which was very much in rebellion against the refinements of the tradition of the Moscow Art Theater and Stanislavski. And if one examines the acting style of Strike, one finds it's compounded partly of the Meyerholdian tradition and partly of memories of American film, of American silent comedy, and partly from circus and music hall techniques, all of which, as highly exteriorized styles of acting, were of particular interest to the Russians, to the students of Meyerhold, to the constructivists, and to their forebears, the futurists. One can say of Strike, I think, as indeed I think I did say, that it's a kind of laboratory, not only of Eisenstein's work, but of the work of the Russians as a whole. And I have said as well that it's the work of a very young man, and what it does have, in a sense, through all its global synectical unity, is a kind of diversity of interests. One can see Eisenstein trying out any number of things. There are even some enigmatic little sequences in reverse action. There are a few frames which are upside down. One finds him playing in those sequences with perhaps just the pure formal effects of silhouettes, of light and dark contrast values. And so that the range of the film runs, as indeed the range of Soviet cinema in general runs, from that of kind of epic narrative to a kind of pure abstraction. That range was to be explored, not only by Eisenstein, but by the other masters of Soviet film, and I would say particularly by those of the other masters who were themselves involved in relationships with other avant-gardist movements in other media. I have in mind, of course, Boris Barnett, and above all, Vertov, Dziga Vertov. It is a cinema which was doomed to perish under the hardening of Stalinism. And it is a cinema in which, though everybody survived, not everybody survived in the best of shape. I think that one can say that between 1923 and 1933, something of great moment did take place, not simply for the history of cinema, but for the history of art in the 20th century, and for the history of consciousness. And this is why, by the way, that it seems to me we need a re-evaluation of this cinema for our generation. Eisenstein in Strike is the forerunner of this movement. You will be seeing films by Pudovkin, you will be seeing a film by Léger, you will be seeing, I think, a short film by Vigo. And as you look at them, if indeed some of you do come back to see the rest of these films, you will, I think, become aware of a certain kind of international community of which these revolutionaries felt themselves to be very, very much a part. We know that when Vertov was working in Ukraine on The Man with the Movie Camera, for example, working therefore away from the pressures of Moscow, that there was great excitement in his studio when French visitors passed through. Questions were asked about Léger's work in the film. We know that when the German Dadaists came to Moscow, they rushed to see Eisenstein and Vertov. We know that when Vertov traveled to Europe in 1927, he saw René Clair's very first film, Paris qui dort, known in this country as The Crazy Ray, and slapped his head in amazement and dismay at the fact that René Clair had made the film he wanted to make before he'd been able to make it. So that there was a certain kind of exchange that was going on all the time. With the hardening of the Stalinist regime, Soviet filmmakers retreated into a kind of isolation. And it was a kind of isolation which was rather curious, because there was a kind of isolation involved very largely with the creation of an illusionist, kind of perfected illusionism, excluding the somewhat apperceptive and reflexive character of Soviet cinema during the 20s and 30s. And it was an illusionism, a narrative film, curiously close to Hollywood. Perhaps at no point was Soviet cinema as close to Hollywood as it was under the Stalinist regime. Eisenstein alone persevered throughout the 40s and made, as you probably know, an extraordinary drama called Ivan the Terrible. It is the last great single lonely work I know in the history of Soviet cinema. It was not appreciated at the time. It has not survived intact, but it still stands 2 parts out of 3 as an immense achievement and a kind of vestige of a vanished age. I think that there might be questions from some of you before we look at Strike, not perhaps about the film, but about some things I've said, or about the film if some of you have already seen it. Yes?
What is the film on your schedule? Some sort of mechanism or some sort of thing?
The Ballet Mécanique of Léger.
Would you like to qualify how that fits in?
Yes, certainly. I've just said that it seems to me important to realize that the Soviet filmmakers were not working in complete isolation, that the kind of aesthetic preoccupations, formal preoccupations, and even social preoccupations that they had were shared by other artists in other media, other filmmakers and artists and filmmakers in other countries. Léger is a major Cubist painter, a late Cubist. His major Cubist works actually last a little later than the kind of classic period of Cubism, which is 1911, 1914. And in the 20s, he turned to filmmaking. He turned to filmmaking after having seen a work by Abel Gance, a French filmmaker, called La Roue, The Wheel, which was an early French montage film, made quite independently of the work of the Russians, in fact made before the Russians. And Léger, seeing this film, was enormously impressed by it, saw the possibilities of montage in the non-narrative form, and decided, as a painter involved in a high degree of abstraction, to make a film which would incarnate that kind and quality and degree of abstraction with which he was concerned as a painter. So that Ballet Mécanique is a montage film contemporary with the Russians. It was made in 1927, which is, say, 2 years after Strike. And it is, I think, an interesting film to see and to compare with the major Russian films of that era, and most particularly the works of Eisenstein and Bertov.
One would hardly call that a Marxist film, but perhaps that direction of film is the reason why it's the final impression.
I'm sorry, I don't understand your question. One could not call the Ballet Mécanique a Marxist film? It depends on what you call a Marxist film to begin with, but let's say it's not a Marxist film. Although there are ways in which, let's put it this way. When Potemkin came out, it was greeted by the Surrealists in Paris as the first, who hadn't made their own films yet. L'Âge d'Or had not yet been made. Potemkin was greeted as the first Surrealist film. Why? Largely because, I feel, Russian film, being montage film, was involved, as I said, in this very highly synthetic kind of technique. The assemblage or the combining of things, the joining of things, very often of very different things to produce a kind of new unity. And Surrealism, as we know, has as one of its basic aesthetic postulates the creation of a new reality from the joining of disparate entities, the meeting of the excuse me, of the sewing machine and the umbrella upon the operating table, dear to Lautréamont and the Surrealists. That is an image of a very particular kind. It's a generative image. It's an image which talks about how new realities are engendered. And curiously enough, when Eisenstein is talking about montage and synthesis, he talks of it as a copulative process. And then, as a matter of fact, with a kind of endearing touch of Russian Puritanism, says, well, we might perhaps try and find another kind of word. That may not be quite the word. But of course, he had hit upon it. And he had hit, I think, upon one of the reasons why the Surrealists greeted Potemkin with such fervor, because they sensed in Russian montage, in Soviet montage, something very, very akin to their own kind of collage technique. Therefore, when you say the Ballet Mécanique, the Ballet Mécanique is neither a Surrealist nor a Marxist film. On the other hand, it shares with both the Marxist films and the Surrealist films something in common, which is a hyperbolic montage technique and a certain kind of shock tactics, and a great many other things like the examination of objects of daily use in strange contexts, etc., etc. So that when you say that it was not a Marxist film, it seems to me that you're making a statement which one might, upon closer examination, modify in some way. Yes. Well, I suppose I could, but it probably would take a month or so. And it would also, this is the point, it would also involve having all the films. I mean, I generally believe in talking quite concretely and quite specifically about films. What I've tried, in a sense, to do, rather than that this evening, is give you some general context for, very briefly and schematically, of course, some general context for seeing all those films. I think that I can talk a little, if you like, about some of the other filmmakers besides Eisenstein, on whom I've concentrated very largely because you're going to see that film this evening. Among the filmmakers that I think one should pay attention to are one of the, perhaps for me, with Eisenstein, the paramount figure is Sergei Vertov. And it is our hope that the print of The Man with the Movie Camera, which we ordered, will be available, though there seems to be some question about that. Let me talk to you a little bit about Vertov, because he represents a very different kind of option, but a very radical option within the range of Soviet cinema. He began his career by declaring war on the dramatic film, the acted film, and he used, in a sense, only what he called live material. But he used it with a sense of artifice and a sense of montage technique, which has, I think, rarely been paralleled. And he produced in 1929 a film called The Man with the Movie Camera, which is probably not only the first, but the ultimate reflexive film we have, a film which is, in a sense, a film apperceptive on the techniques of cinema itself. It is, I think, a supreme instance of a philosophical cinema as well. That is a cinema which stands as a kind of agent of reflection about the nature of art, about the nature of aesthetics, about the nature of filmmaking, and about the nature of filmmaking as an epistemological enterprise. So that between Eisenstein, who I think incarnates a kind of epic narrative tradition, and Vertov, you have an immense range, which I could not begin to fill in for you now, unfortunately, without going, well beyond the time allotted to me, and I can't do it really without the films here. I'm sorry, I would like to, but this is something I generally spend a few months doing. Yes.
I'd like to ask you a question, which is really two, I guess, about what you call the use and misuse of montage. I haven't seen Strike, so I ask this in search of our ignorance. But you mentioned the final sequence where the slaughter of the strike is compared to the slaughter of the gentleman. I have read that Eisenstein, or some of his critics, have felt that this was a misuse of montage, that it was overtly didactic and overtly political, and that Eisenstein subsequently chose to get away from this kind of thing. And what I would like to ask is, did Eisenstein in fact feel that way? And do other critics subsequently felt that way? It was a mistake. It was overtly political.
Well, that's true. Your question does contain a number of issues, a number of questions. To begin with, I do not myself, in any of the critical or historical literature, know of any statement by Eisenstein to the effect that he rejected his ending of strike. Secondly, or the method. Secondly, I do not think that for Eisenstein or for most of the major filmmakers of that generation, the political and the didactic character of a montage sequence argued against it. They really conceived their roles as agents of revolution, as revolutionary filmmakers, and therefore as participants in the education and the organization of post-revolutionary society. They did not in any way reject or consider unworthy of them the didactic or the political role. Okay.
Well, okay, that answers my question about how Eisenstein felt. I understand he's revolutionary and saw cinema as a revolutionary education tool. But is this not a misuse of cinema to force people to see in a montage technique only one specific thing to give not a distortion of reality?
Well, I mean, obviously you pose the question of the nature of that reality which is presumably distorted. A great many of us do not pretend to any particular kind of hold on or grasp of reality or any particular kind of objectivity. For many of us, objectivity is not necessarily possible or value. Let me just give you an instance of this. There there was in the 30s in New York a club called the John Reed Club. The John Reed Club founded a magazine which later became known as Partisan Review. When I was a student, Partisan Review was alive. It no longer is. It has survived, but it is no longer very lively. When I was a student, you read Partisan Review. And I was a student during the really, really cold part of the Cold War. During the Cold War, a young man with a strong sociological bent and a certain kind of fondness for films began to write earnest, moderately successful film criticism in Partisan Review. His name is Robert Warshaw. Like most of the film critics of that period, Bazin, A.G., all of them with a strong bent toward the aesthetics of a certain kind of realism and a certain kind of liberal sociological quality. He died young. He wrote, I remember, an article in which he took it upon himself to reevaluate the Russian cinema. He simply spent a few weeks in a movie theater or a museum of modern art looking at films and declared, Cold Warrior that he was at the time, that history had made a mockery of October, of Potemkin, etc., etc. And this is an extremely interesting article to read now, because you realize, of course, that he was speaking from a point of view which, in the name of a certain kind of liberal objectivity, claimed that history had made a mockery of these films. But of course he was no more objective in his political orientation than the people whom he was reproaching. And during the 50s, this was received opinion that the Russians had been very clever, they'd invented something called montage, etc., but that they had misused it. Since you've asked me a question, I will give you an answer. No, I do not think they misused it. My feeling is that they used it, and that they had a kind of revolutionary sense of art as being, in effect, very, very much implicated in the transformation of society. Now, this is a general position which one can dispute, and indeed which is disputed in the intellectual journals of this country all the time. But since you've asked me for my view, I will tell you what it is, or I have told you what it is. Are there other questions? Yeah, I think it's about time.